Thank you for the invitation. I'm sorry, but I prefer to speak Italian. I'm now the Vaticanist of the Italian newspaper La Stampa. I changed my job in 1 month ago. Volevo iniziare
I should like to begin and talking about the attack on Ratzinger. And the second portion of my talk, instead, I shall focus in particular on a chapter of my book, or rather the book that I wrote together with Mr. Paolo Rodari, and that we dedicated precisely to prophecies. Now, as was stated in the introduction that was just made, the book focuses on 12 episodes, 12 attacks on Ratzinger. In the book, basically, we make a distinction, or rather we rank, we classify the attacks on the Pope. We break them down into 3 different types. There are attacks which come from outside, from what we decide as the outer circle. They come from lobbies, institutions or institutes, political groups, economic groups, groups that speak openly against the church. Now, these cases, depending on these groups, depending on cases and situations, attack the Pope and the teachings of the Church. This was seen in a dramatic manner in March of 2009 when the Pope went to Africa on a wonderful journey to the Cameroon and Angola, and where he delivered some wonderful addresses on African theology. Some beautiful liturgies, masses were celebrated, and yet the entire trip was basically deleted or wiped away as a result of a controversy that took place at the very beginning when we were still on the plane during the interview with the journalists as a result of an answer that the Pope gave to a question. On that occasion, the Pope was attacked also by parliaments. And I believe that the Belgian parliament discussed the matter. Indeed, there was the intention to bring a motion against the Pope on the part of the European Parliament. The French and the Spanish foreign ministers spoke against the Pope simply because in answering a question as to the Church's position on AIDS, the Pope said quite simply, quite straightforwardly, and quite honestly that money and the extensive distribution of a condom does not solve the problem. Quite the contrary. The widespread distribution of condoms runs the risk of aggravating or exacerbating the situation. It was scientifically proven, really, that the only cases in which it was possible to reduce, to curb substantially the spread of AIDS was the result of an educational process or program, education to sexuality, to avoid promiscuous relations or sexual relations at a very young age. So these are really the only cases. And the Pope is perfectly right in saying that the distribution of condoms per se is not a solution to the problem. Quite the contrary, it can contribute towards worsening it because it conveys a fake or false safety, but it actually contributes towards its spread. Now, this is something that actually came out in scientific journals and reviews, but when the Pope actually gave this answer, a terrible controversy was unleashed, and nobody around the Pope considered the possibility of immediately providing the information that I have just mentioned, this background information that would have helped to better understand and interpret the words pronounced by the Pope. So that's just an example of how the Pope has been unfairly attacked. Now, we should not consider, though, we should not think that the attacks that come from this outer circle are attacks that involve only the moral teachings of the Church, so homosexual couples, the teachings on the Church of the Church on premarital relations, in vitro fertilization, artificial insemination, and so on and so forth. There are other forces that would like to describe the Church almost as a Protestant sect that can say whatever it wants, but whatever it says really doesn't reach out to many people. The Church today really is a voice that speaks to people, so people want to narrow it down, to curb it, to silence it. So it's not just a matter of moral issues. There are issues such as globalization that come into play. The Pope spoke some beautiful words in terms of a Christian ecology that has nothing to do with the green ideals and ideology that is espoused by those who believe that man is Earth's cancer, so to speak. There's a good ecology that promotes the protection of creation, which is what the Pope speaks about when he speaks about the need for everybody to have equal access to resources, natural resources. And then the Pope, of course, took some very firm stands in terms of war or in relation to war. So you see there are forces, lobbies, groups that are not necessarily always the same, that alternate, but that have an interest in challenging the Church. There's a second circle that exists inside the Church, within the Church. I'm referring to attacks that on the Pope that are the result of internal discord. Now, there's no need, of course, to always be in agreement. Engaging in a sound discussion is useful. But in the Church, amongst cardinals and bishops, in some cases there are very distant positions, also vis-a-vis the positions of the Pope. And that is odd if you consider that the Church should be viewed as a community that has been summoned by God, by an external force. The Church is not a reality that we have built with our own hands. The Church, as Benedict XVI teaches us, is not a corporation, it's not a trade union, nor is it a parliamentary assembly. The Church is indeed a reality that was created by God. It was summoned by God, and all the members of the faithful, the clergy, the bishops, archbishops, and so on, they are all gathered together in the name of God, and their eyes are all turned to God. So according to this position, if the Pope makes a decision, says something, issues or releases a document, really the first feeling, or rather the first reaction of all Catholics should be to accept, to try to understand why it is that the Pope is saying what he's saying or is moving in a given direction. Because if you are Catholic, you know that the Holy Father is supported by the Holy Spirit. We all have our personal opinions, but what the Pope writes, his magisterium, differs from what I write, of course. So within the Church, there's a need. We need for there to be sympathy towards Peter's successors, to try to understand what he does and what he says before criticizing him, before attacking him on the basis of our own personal opinions. And lastly, there's a third circle, which is even tighter circle, of course, of attacks, again, which we have defined in the book as the circle of the co-workers and collaborators. In these first 6 years of pontificate, pontificate, of Benedict's pontificate, some of the crises that have broken out were the result not of external attacks, but rather they were the result of, or they flowed from shortcomings or flaws on the flawed attitudes and behaviors on the part of the Pope's advisors. Now, nothing, of course, was done intentionally or with the evil intention of intentionally, truly wanting to harm the Pope, but as a result of the lack of experience or the inability to conduct one's work effectively. Anyway, some of these crises could surely be avoided if something was done prior to the crisis breaking out, trying to provide direct answers right away when the crises occurred. So that's as much as I wanted to say with regard to the book. There's a chapter of the book that we have devoted to prophecies because we wrote the book immediately after the Pope's trip to Fatima. I had sent to the spokesperson and the head of the Vatican's press office a question for the Pope. What usually happens is that the journalists who travel with the Holy Father usually send some questions by email before time, ahead of time. The questions are collected. Some are selected, and they're put to the Pope. Now, one of these questions had been presented by myself, and in this question, I asked whether there could be a nexus, a connection between the Secret of Fatima and the crisis that the Church was experiencing at that particular moment as a result of the sex scandals or sexual abuse scandals. Quite surprisingly, the Pope replied with an answer that I believe all of you are familiar with. The Pope said that we stand before a terrifying vision. Basically, the greatest persecution for the Church today comes from the sin within the Church. So I'd like to take a few steps back and go back to the year 2000 when the text of Fatima's vision was released. I remember that during a press conference, I put a question to the then Cardinal Ratzinger. It was June of 2000, and I asked the Cardinal whether he didn't think that this vision, rather than being merely limited to the attack on the Pope of 1981. And tomorrow, by the way, we will be celebrating the 30th anniversary of that attack. Anyway, I asked the Cardinal whether the vision also included or was broader, so as to include also the suffering of endured by all the popes of the 20th century. John Paul I died after 33 days of pontificate. Paul VI had suffered an attack in Manila in 1970, much more serious than was actually told. He had been stabbed 2 centimeters near the heart. And consider all the accusations against Pius XII, all the very tough criticism. There were many popes in the 20th century that suffered in a very special way, who had been come heavily under attack. And I asked whether all of this could be covered or somehow encompassed by Fatima, and he answered yes. Yes, and although you might remember that Ratzinger has always said that John Paul II believed or actually identified with the Fatima vision. These important words are very important. There's no official interpretation of the vision of Fatima. Ratzinger said this. There is no such thing. John Paul II actually identified with that vision, and he stated this. And Ratzinger actually said that it could be considered to be a little broader. I remember that after the release of The Secret, one of the texts, the portions that was published by the Pauline editions in Italy, bore the comment or carried the commentary of Rino Fisichella, who at the time was auxiliary bishop of Rome. And in his comment, Fisichella at one point wrote, we might think that the Fatima prophecy has not been fulfilled. I remember that when I read these words, I immediately wrote an article in which I said, Fisichella, who's a consultor of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, writes that according to him, the Fatima prophecy cannot be considered to be entirely fulfilled. You know, I've never been, he didn't say this to me, of course. He hadn't said this to me during an interview, but I had actually read this. It was printed. There was no response or no reply to this. But 10 years later, Monsignor Fisichella said to me that my article had somehow disturbed him, upset him. It's interesting to note that 10 years after the release of the text of The Secret, the Pope and even Cardinal Bertone are saying the same. Basically, the prophecy cannot be considered to be fulfilled, entirely fulfilled at any rate. Another interesting point that we underscore in the book has to do with something that was told to Monsignor Pasquale Macchi, the special personal secretary of Paul VI, to a priest, a friend of his. In the book, we actually write down the name of the priest, and he said the following to this priest. When Paul VI spoke about Satan's smoke, was actually referring to the priests who challenge the church, or who challenge the church, who are not faithful to their identity, who do not who are not true and faithful to their celibacy, and he refers to disobedience towards the magisterium of the church. The Pope connects these phenomena and the to the Secret of Fatima. I found this to be very interesting because Paul VI suffered personally, not just from a moral standpoint, but physically. He suffered as a result of the loss of so many priests. When he received the documents with the request for dispensation in those years that followed Vatican II, he cried. I remember I wrote a biography of Paul VI, and I tell the story that was actually shared with me by one of the secretaries. He called this his Calvary, his way of the cross, the reading of the requests for dispensation that were submitted by so many priests. It was interesting what Macchi wrote about the fact that the Pope associated these phenomena with the Secret of Fatima, the fact that so many priests wanted to leave the church with the Secret of Fatima. Now, there's one point that I would like to emphasize. You see, you can analyze a fact. You know, let's take the Secret of Fatima, the inconsistencies, whether the whole of the secret has been revealed or not, what portion has not been revealed, is there a fourth or not, the envelopes, the Barbarigo writing desk. I mean, you can delve deep into the situation, and you can go down to the tiniest detail. But when you go down that much, like, you know, just like a surgeon, you end up losing sight of the picture as a whole. So many times, you know, there's a joke in Italy according to which surgery is, the surgery has been is successful, so much so that the patient is dead, which is to say that when you go delve too deeply, what you can do is you can solve the problem, but you lose sight of the general sense of the matter or something. So I urge us to step back. Let's take a broad look at the 20th century, what happened in Fatima, the prophecy, the mistakes of communism, and all the events involving Russia. So a broader outlook on things, and consider also other things that happened. For instance, in 1973, in Japan, in Akita, there was an apparition that bishops have recognized or acknowledged. Akita is just a few kilometers away from the places that were devastated by the tsunami that struck Japan a couple of months ago. It was 1973, as I said. Sister Agnes Sasagawa saw Our Lady, and we're talking about an apparition that has been recognized. It's not a secret. It's not something that has not been recognized. It's been recognized and acknowledged. And the message is, the work of the devil shall creep into the church in such a way that cardinals shall be pitted against other cardinals, bishops against other bishops, and the priests who worship me shall be despised and rejected by their own brothers. Altars shall be sacked. The churches shall be crowded by people, teeming with people who accept compromises. The former Philippines ambassador, Howard D. at the Holy See, said in an interview with the journal Inside the Vatican that one day, in talking with the then Cardinal Ratzinger, and by the way, the recognition of the Akita apparition, the apparition had been recognized by the local bishop, having heard, of course, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. So anyway, the ambassador said, Ratzinger confirmed that message and the message of Fatima are basically one and the same, basically the same thing. What does that mean? A call to conversion, but an underscoring of difficult times in the church. In 1995, close by in Civitavecchia, in Pantano, a statue coming from Medjugorje began to weep, and tears of blood streaked its face. The local bishop said, this is crazy, it's absurd, I don't believe in this is nonsense. In the space of just a few days, the statue cried as many as 13 times, and there were many, many witnesses, including non-believers, believers who rendered witness, testifying to the fact that they had seen the statue cry, weep tears of blood. In March 1995, this statue cried one last time in the hands of the bishop before as many as 3 witnesses. The bishop, at that point, almost had a heart attack, really, and he was called. He was so overwhelmed by the fact that the cardiologist was called in. He visited the bishop, and the cardiologist himself saw this. I remember writing an interview, publishing an interview. And anyway, the cardiologist himself testified to the fact that yet another tear rolled down the face of this statue. So it's quite obvious that the testimony of the cardiologist shows that there was no trick. Unless one wants to believe that the bishop and the sisters, they were all the victims of a terrible trick. Anyway, the bishop changed, of course, had a change of heart. He received a phone call from Cardinal Sodano late in the evening and said, Grillo, please, try to open up your mind to the supernatural. He spoke on behalf of the Pope. And Pope John Paul II secretly wanted for the bishop to bring this statue to his chambers in June of 1995, and the Pope kneeled before the statue and prayed before it because he believed that those tears were true, that they were a sign, a celestial sign, a heavenly sign. They were tears of blood. They were not of course, one couldn't possibly think that they were a sign heralding something good was coming along, quite the opposite. A few years later, the Pope left a written testimony of this fact, and he signed with his own hand a letter describing the facts, and basically it's a document that exists. It's proof, it's evidence. The Pope truly believed in the events of Civitavecchia, and the Civitavecchia messages that were given to this, communicated to this little girl who was the owner of the statue and who said that she spoke to a beautiful woman. Anyway, the bishop was told about some secrets, secrets involving many people who were around him. Anyway, once again, if you take a step back and you don't just focus on details but take a broader look at things, you see that there's a continuity in many of these messages and Marian apparitions, both the ones that have been recognized and those that have not. So if the message is the same in all of these apparitions, even those that are not recognized, lead us to think that they say one and the same thing. They communicate the same message. So if we consider that, I think that it's only fair to say, or rather, it's better, we can understand more easily. It's easier for us to understand the answer of the Pope to my question as to connection between the Fatima secret and the sexual abuse scandals when he said this terrifying vision isn't simply something that is to be pushed back in the past or that belongs to the past. Rather, he said the toughest persecution against the Church does not come from its external enemies, but is the result of the sin that afflicts the Church from within. And I think that with this was a very courageous answer. You see, as I see it, and you might think differently, but this should not just be considered in the light of Fatima, but in the light of a pontificate, that of Benedict XVI, that began who began his pontificate saying, "Pray that I do not escape when chased by wolves." And he had to carry a cross, making atonement for the filth, the dirt that's in the Church, and that he announced that way of the cross at the Colosseum in 2005. But in his pontificate, he's pointing the way that is based on penance, justice, because you see, what was not fulfilled in the previous years, oftentimes to prevent scandals, basically failing to listen to the victims, failing to devote human attention to the victims of these heinous events. So justice, penance, and also a radical call to what the gospel truly is. Please allow me to conclude by quoting two speeches, two addresses of the Pope in Portugal. They are not directly associated with the Fatima secret, but I think that they dramatically point to what the Pope considers to be as the greatest urgency for the Church today. Lisbon, May 11th, 2010. We often worry frantically about the social, cultural, political consequences of the faith, and we take for granted the fact that this faith is actually there. And unfortunately, this is less and less realistic. Now, these words sort of fell into oblivion. I bring these back to your attention. They're dramatic. The Pope is telling us, oftentimes we the Church, of course, worry about the social, political consequences. We worry about pastoral strategies, and we take it for granted that there's faith. And the Pope says this is no longer necessarily true. And he goes on to say, too much confidence has been given to the church programs and structures and the distribution of powers and functions. But what will happen if salt becomes insipid and tasteless, if that salt no longer has flavor? Another quote, Fatima, May 13th, 2010, the Mass celebrated at the Fatima Shrine. When in the heart of many people, the Catholic faith is no longer considered to be as a common heritage belonging to society. And oftentimes it is seen as a seed that is overshadowed by other divinities of this world. He's describing basically the condition, the situation of most of the Western world. The Pope goes on to add, it is quite unlikely that it will be able to really touch the hearts, the Catholic faith, of course, will be able to touch the hearts of people through simple speeches, simple words, or moral reminders, and even less so through general appeals to or reminders of Catholic values. Today, we live in a society in which people constantly refer to Christian values. Even politicians go so far as to do so. And yet the Pope says, words are no longer sufficient today, not even a reference to moral values, because you see, there is such a thing as natural morals. But if you don't have that nail of faith that hangs on the wall, morals are like pieces of cloth that fall to the ground because they can't be hung up on that wall onto that nail. So the Pope concludes in saying that talking words that don't really reach the heart of people don't change a life. What truly fascinates is especially the encounter with people who are believers, people who through their faith draw to the grace of Christ, rendering witness and by becoming witnesses or testifying to Him. So basically, the Pope calls for a new evangelization and a testimony that is a living testimony based on life, not words, not cultural battles, but a living testimony, always having clear in front of our eyes a clear idea or notion of what the Church is and what it's all about. We've been summoned by others, by someone else, but by God, by Christ, who has given everything we have gratuitously. Without our deserving it. And when we look to the Church, we must never see it as a business, a trade union, a corporation. We must see it for what it truly is, and we must always remember, I say this not I to you, but I to myself in my day-to-day work. I think that we must always remember that God, or rather Jesus Christ, God who became man, is always jealous of His spouse, of His church. I'd like to finish with the words of Giacomo Biffi, once Archbishop of Bologna, who in answering in responding to those who criticize the Church, the bishops and cardinals, also from within the Church, said, remember, this is a very Italian line of thinking, remember that Jesus was born in Palestine. He's from the south. In Italy, people from the south have a very specific tradition and culture, and they are known to be very jealous people, very jealous of their wife, their husband. And Biffi said, remember that Jesus is a southerner. Be careful, beware when you badmouth his wife or his spouse. Thank you.
Thank you, Tornielli. We're now going to have a Q&A session.
In English, and if we need assistance in translation, we will do that as well. Christopher.
Signor Tornielli, in primo luogo, grazie per la sua testimonianza.
First of all, thank you very much for your excellent presentation with regards to the description of the state of the art of the church as is today. During his pilgrimage to Fatima, the Pope has very clearly stated that the secret of Fatima refers to an attack on the church from the enemies from within. But the vision in itself, the only thing that we do not see in this vision is an attack from the enemies from within the church. So the Pope, as the way I see it, has made reference to the existence of a text which refers to this internal attack. Do you share with me this opinion? Well, I want to be very blunt. Well, the question was, is there a link between Fatima and the scandals? Now, the answer that the Pope has given is pretty long, but he says, well, we have to say that in his answer, the Pope never makes reference of the word secret. He only refers to the word message. The Pope says of the Fatima message. He speaks of a Fatima message. So what you're saying is reasonable. I mean, we may take this into consideration, but this is not the only option. I mean, I don't think there's only such explanation, because the Pope says with regards to the new things that we may find today in this new message, that is, today we find new things in the message that we've been knowing since the year 2000. So he's not saying, doesn't speak text, vision, or secret. He's always using the word message. So the message is not only the vision of the secret, but it's a message which also makes reference to conversion, the fact that if there is no conversion, human beings will go through very hard times. So I think that the Pope was also making reference to a wider scope in a way. So your question is very proper, very fitting, very proper. I mean, this is could be one of his interpretations, but in the words of the Pope, we see that he's making reference to the message of Fatima as a whole. I would also like to add another point. In the message as such, no reference is made to an internal attack within the church. So I think this may well indicate the existence of another text, but I well understood what your position, your answer. Well, this may well be. I mean, this is one of... Well, let's put things this way. Well, you know this better than me, and I'm not going to teach you anything on this when it comes to the message of Fatima, but I would urge you not to downsize the relevance of the revealed vision, because the risk here is that since we lack the interpretation, we lack the words of Our Lady. Well, what do we have here? We have a city which is destroyed. We have Christians which are dead, and a Pope who is killed. So this is an apocalyptic vision, and it is a terrifying vision. So in the message that we know, the message that was published, that the Vatican authorities say this is the only message. But if we just stick to the message in itself, I mean, it's not that we're talking about a somewhat blurred vision. We are talking about persecution, a terrifying persecution, which is which is also affecting the Pope. So if this is a vision which refers to the future, which is a still unfulfilled vision, which it has been admitted many occasions, this is then something that we must not neglect, underestimate. Yes, but in the vision, we see that there is an attack by a group of soldiers. And so these are external enemies of the church. This is not an internal attack. So this is the problem that I see. In the essence. So I mean, this is the real issue, the real problem. I mean, in the vision, there's no such thing as an internal attack. The internal enemies of the church. This is really a huge problem as opposed to the official version.
Credo che capisci inglese, vero, Signor Tornaglia? Sì. I'd like to ask in English, but I agree with Mr. Tornelli. First of all, it is a great thing that the Church, that Cardinal Bertone, that the Pope are all saying today that the event shown in the vision of the Bishop in White, going up the hill, going through a destroyed or half-destroyed city, climbing over the bodies of the dead and so forth, that this refers to a future event. And this is a great step forward, that this is being acknowledged in public by the officials of the Church. And it is certainly an apocalyptic thing and something very terrible. The problem that we have is that because we respect the Holy Father and the Vatican and the Secretary of State so much, it would help our work of more than 30 years if they would simply say this a little clearer, a little louder, so that the common person would get this message. Because when it comes from someone like me, they just say, oh, well, don't pay attention to him, he's only by himself. If the Vatican, the Pope, the Cardinal Secretary of State, the other officials would say this openly, contrary to the impression that was given in 2000, this would be a much greater thing. I would be very grateful for that. Is there any chance of that happening? I'd like to, if you know.
Sì, io credo che sia importante quanto lei ha detto.
Yes, indeed. I think it is very important to have this acknowledgement. I was in Fatima May 13th in the year 2000 when Cardinal Sodano said that the Secret of Fatima with a Pope who fell as dead, he was making reference to a period of history which referred to the clashes with the ideologies and clashes with communism. But my personal opinion, and I want to be very candid on this, is the following. I think Catholics know very well that they have to be with Peter, and the responsibility of Peter is to lead the church. So if Catholics are with Peter, of course, Peter has to show things or truth which do not have to be opposite to the church. But if Catholics follow the Pope, then they are serene. They know they have been following the right thing. So, no, this is an assumption, this is an hypothesis, because, I mean, I've been going through, I read all the books about the possible existence of an unrevealed part or text, but there is evidence, I mean, there are inconsistencies, but history shows, and even history of the Vatican shows, that sometimes things can be explained differently. I mean, not necessarily mean that if there's an inconsistency, then there has been some manipulation. I mean, this is my personal opinion. I don't want to persuade you on this. But if there were other messages, Sister Lucy used to send many letters to the Vatican, many voice recorded messages, and then all the way back to the 80s. So there was a lot of material coming from Sister Lucy. So if the Pope, who is head of the Church, has made the decision to reveal the vision, to give this interpretation, then I must say, in all honesty, I mean, I love reading literature about this, and I, look for evidence about this. This is my job. But I fully trust the Pope. I have confidence in him. So in the year 2000, people believed that Fatima was just something referring to the past. But the Pope, in that very year of 2000, he wanted to have the the statue of Fatima in St. Peter's Square. And I remember in his homily, he said something which went unnoticed. I remember during the 2000, there was this big euphoria because of the Jubilee and the big hope, great expectations for the new century, a century of peace. And now it is true that many wars still existed, many events of violence existed, but the Pope said humanity is at a crossroads. It can either transform the world in a garden or in a total wreckage or in a dump of waste. So just a few months later, we saw with 9/11 what happened, and to what extent religion and hatred and terrorism have disrupted the history of humanity, so much so that today still we're going through these hard times. So I really think that in the year 2000, I'm not sure the Pope, but anyway, certainly his staff really believed that the Secret of Fatima was something which was relegated to the past. Whereas today, I think they've also changed their position. I think they are clear on this also because of the new events which have unfolded. So I think that there's a new consciousness which is developing. So I think we have to look on that, and I think, of course, we have to stand by Jesus Christ, but we have to stand by the Pope, who is his representative. So we have to stick to the Pope and not to our beliefs and our convictions. I mean, we know that this is the way we can go to heaven. Then if the Pope has made decisions which God does not approve, then that will be a problem of the Pope with him. But if we follow the Pope, then we will all going to heaven.
Se posso fare una domanda prima.
One other question.
C'era questa impressione dato al pubblico nel 2000 con tutta la stampa mondiale lì, non si può entrare anche nella camera di stampa perché era detto che
there was this big press conference in the year 2000. And the question was, does the Secret of Fatima only refer to the past? As Cardinal Sodana said, and as Cardinal Ratzinger said, do we have, now I can't remember exactly the words, but I mean, do we have to follow the words of what Cardinal Sodana is saying? And then today, Cardinal Bertone was saying that this decision to unveil the third secret
il periodo del mondo che è pieno di malvagità.
Put an end to the world full of evils. And I remember the words of Cardinal Bertone.
E questa impressione è ancora dato al pubblico che
People say that we are against the Holy Father, but it is not so. And the message of Fatima, it is said that the Pope will be killed like the King of France. And what we're trying to do, we're trying to save the life of the Pope. And just like Michel Kenyo at the Trento Council said, the Pope does not need to say, I mean, we don't need to say everyone's good. I mean, even in paragraph 87 of the Second Vatican Council, and even in canon law, reference is made to the need to give advice, and even to the Holy Father. I mean, if we do not give importance or sufficient importance to the consecration, this will bring disgrace. This will bring tragedy for the Pope, for the bishops, and all the rest. I mean, the message is very clear. I mean, I remember De Carli last year, or people like you. I mean, we need to really understand what are the details, what are the very facts. I mean, the things that we need to do, because there's no other option, there's no other way. This is a garden that John Paul II wanted for the world, and there's no other way except for this plan of Our Lady, which has not been fulfilled. Now, if there is another text, and I remember even last year at this TV program, you see, I mean, that there would be an attachment to the secret. John 23rd said, I'm not going to pass any judgment. And even Paul VI said, I'm not going to pass any judgment on this text. But, I mean, a judgment on the authenticity of this text. I think that, I mean...
Ma io l'anno scorso a quella trasmissione ho detto...
Well, last year at this TV program, I said that there may be an attachment, and I said that this attachment may explain the inconsistencies, but I have no grounds to ascertain that this attachment does exist, since I know that Sister Lucy has written a lot and has sent a lot of voice recordings to the Vatican. I do not want to rule out that there may well be letters, interpretations, or even an attachment to this. I mean, I can't rule this out. But on the other hand, I have the following doubt. If this text really does exist, and it is a very important text, wherein Sister Lucy gives an explication that Our Lady has given to this vision. Still, we need to understand why into separate pieces of paper, etc. But the one thing I really don't find it hard to understand is the responsibility that the Pope has taken upon himself. Now, we're not talking about Cardinal, we're talking about the Pope, because the person who has decided to publish on what have been the Popes. The Popes have read the text and have decided to publish it. So he has taken upon himself the responsibility of publishing one part and to conceal the other part. This is a huge responsibility if we're talking about the words of Our Lady, the message of Our Lady. So this is, I mean, this is a huge question mark for me. I think there may be another explanation to this inconsistency as to the death of Pope Luciani. So many mistakes have been made. I'm sure that he has not been killed, but there are so many inconsistencies. I mean, the Vatican is not made by perfect people. many things happen which are not due to the fact that people are wicked, but simply because things may happen. So there may well be different explanations for the inconsistencies. To date, I have found no real evidence that there actually is a concealed part of the secret. Now, of course, I'm doing my job, I'm doing my work, I'm trying to find something, but you made reference to the bishop at the Trento Council and the Second Vatican Council. I think that what is really important, what really matters when we do these things, when we send out these messages, when we ask for the Church to pay attention to these events, we must never forget at the same time what Church really stands for. We must never forget charity. I mean, we cannot say pit the wicked against the good, saying he is good, he is wicked. I mean, we must fully respect people, and we must not assume right from the start that there is some malice behind all this, and the willingness to conceal a message from Our Lady. Bertoni prays the Rosary every single night. So I think that even when we do our job, I think that we must never forget charity, which is...
All'interno della Chiesa.
Sì, sono d'accordo. Ma voglio rispondere su questo argomento. Per esempio, io non penso...
I don't think this is a matter of responsibility of Cardinal Bertone or of John Paul II or of the present Pope. I think there's a theory. I think that in Porta a Portila, Cardinal Bertone has taken the stance. He says, well, we know what he said during this TV message. He was very clear on this. Cardinal Bertone said that the other text, which is not, authentic, because the other text is criticizing other people. I mean, to his, he says it is impossible that Our Lady would say these things because Our Lady is help for the Christians. So he rules out the fact that she may say these words. But we know from the Holy Scriptures that there will be a case apostasy. We know this from the Holy Scriptures. And St. Paul said... in chapter 20, chapter 28, that
che si alzano, che portano dottrina per portare la gente, seguono loro invece di Cristo. Questo è nella scrittura. Perciò non è impossibile da sé, ma lui a priori dice...
So what he says that Our Lady could never have said this. So he says, since this is not authentic, I will do my duty to see this is the whole secret, but he made I think he made an intellectual mistake, but this doesn't mean that he is bad.
A cui io non credo che sia secondo me, non credo che sia corretta la sua analisi, spiego perché. Vedete, bisogna ricordare che
Well, I have to remind you that Cardinal Bertone at the time was the Archbishop and Secretary of the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith. Was number 2. The prefect was Joseph Ratzinger, and the Pope was John Paul II. Both Ratzinger and John Paul II knew about the secret and had read the secret long before Cardinal Bertone arrived to Rome. Now, even on the assumption that there's a second hidden text. Ratzinger and John Paul II were supposed to have read the secret, the whole secret, including this other document. What happened in the year 2000 is not to be given as a responsibility to Bertone. The two bosses of Bertone were both Ratzinger and the Pope, and they had known the secret long before. No, I don't really want to put the blame on Bertone. The assumption of a second text is there, and I think that Ratzinger already back in 1984 believed in the authenticity of this text. In the year 2000, and he didn't say anything about the authenticity, and then again in 2010 he changed his position. It's a judgment, an intellectual judgment or assumption that has been followed, maybe on good faith from one side or the other, that has been followed. The conclusions of this primary judgment, of this primary opinion, were followed along the history of this whole history. I've been studying this for 35 years, and I came to the conclusion that popes never wanted to express an official judgment. As a theologist which is loyal to the Church and to the popes and to Cardinal Bertone, I want to save also his life. St. Thomas of Aquin is the first fruit of an error is injustice. So rule unite the existence or the authenticity of this text without an official judgment is unfair towards us, that without releasing any moral judgment, because they follow a moral judgment, but they rule out the possibility for us to know the truth or to form an opinion. Otherwise, the Pope could say this text is fake, and that would be an official judgment. But I think that all the Catholics, in their own right, as defined by the First Vatican Council and by the Second Council of Leon, has established in the Materia Ecclesiae, all the Catholics have the right to request a judgment, and that is exactly what we are doing. Well, if you allow me, this is not a criticism, it's just an opinion. Your mission is related to Fatima, and I do understand that you focus on Fatima. But one should be very cautious and not to lose sight of what is the general picture of all the messages of Our Lady. Even if we don't know the text, there are many other apparitions that are actually calling for conversion and for a change of heart. Being Christians, we always have to consider that even when we're talking about apocalypse, devastation, catastrophes, war, and the future of the world, we cannot be sure that we'll be on this world tomorrow morning. And life is a gift of God, and God can take it away from us at any moment. So our last days can be tomorrow, thus the need for conversion. So I do believe that we have to consider this message from a general standpoint and to realize that we need to pray and to have trust in Our Lady and to understand the deepest meaning of her message. Now, in the Secrets of Fatima, in Fatima's vision, John Paul II is included. He was fired, he was shot on the very day of Fatima's apparition. So I think that John Paul II was included, and I think that a prayer can change history. When you talk about church, about the sort of course of history in general, we have to come to terms with the fact there's a sort of a balance that cannot be stricken because there are so many things that we do not know. How many families, how many lives were saved for phenomena we are not aware of. And sometimes we receive the sacraments from people that maybe are not up to their functions and their duties. And even without opening up or unveiling the Vatican archives, or without forcing Cardinal Bertone to say something new or to utter some new truth about Fatima, we have to live through our times with a real Christian attitude. Well, a very last question. I really would like to thank you for the real Christian spirit that you convey. I think that what we are living through is a crisis in our faith, and I think you quite rightly underline that in the words of the Pope. Now, going back to simplicity and to simplicity of the soul of children. If you don't think as children, you will not be saved. And speaking about the consecration of Russia, I recall the need to bathe 7 times on the Dorvan River. That is a request to the Syrian king. The servant told the king, well, if you were requested to do something more difficult, a more difficult ordeal, you would have done it. Why don't you simply accept to bathe? And it does, and is cured. In Guadalupe, Saint Mary request a little chapel to be built in order to give her gifts to the inhabitants of the continent. The cardinal refuses, but then at the end is convinced because of the signs that Juan Diego bears. And all the Latin American indigenous people converted and accepted Catholic faith. That was unthinkable before this. But why the consecration of Russia is not performed explicitly as it is requested by Saint Mary? Why can't we go back to this simplicity, to this simple token of faith? The conversion, this is all very good, but this is bigger than us. While here, Our Lady is asking us something much simpler than that. I really have to apologize. There are questions that I cannot give an answer to. I'm a journalist. I would like to remind you that something has happened in all the Eastern European countries, that communism has crumbled down practically without casualties, that we were on the verge of yet another world war, and that didn't burst out, and that the perestroika was there, and in the 80s we really were on the verge of another great war. So I cannot exclude an intervention, a rather remarkable intervention of Our Lady. Now, this is the very last question. Your co-author, Paolo Rodari, has accepted or admitted the possibility that Antonio Sacchi is right, that there might be a second text or an attachment. Would you accept that? Would you admit that? It wasn't, he didn't really say notes or attachments. He said a text. I said, and I said it on TV, although I have no evidence of that, I'm a good friend of Sacchi and I read his book. But I believe that many of the things he has written and that you can find also in many books that are critical vis-a-vis the Vatican party line might be true. I do not rule out the possibility of an attachment to exist. I'm surprised that certainly not an ordinary person, as the Pope Secretary of State, has denied it so vigorously. If this text existed, well, that would be sort of a real blow to him. My friend De Carli actually left us only 2 months before taking the floor in this conference. Very often spoke about that. And I often told my friend De Carli that I cannot exclude or rule out this possibility. This is the inconsistencies that are undeniably there and might be explained otherwise anyway. Thank you.
The Blessed Virgin gave us a message how to have world peace, that only she can help us. But perhaps we don't get enough perspective. We say, well, nothing dramatic has happened. And it's because our commentators, our newspapers, our editor writers, the people that we really pay attention to, the people that speak on television, in the mainstream press and so forth, people who are under the pay of the enemy often, have yet to point out to us that since we have despised Our Lady's message as the human family, we've despised it, there have been 1,686,570,000 violent deaths as a direct result of ignoring Our Lady of Fatima. That is, again, 1 billion. That is 1 with 9 zeros after it, plus another 686 million people who have died violently for the one simple reason that we've ignored Our Lady of Fatima. We could point out, perhaps another time, that if this is not enough perspective to give us that in these 95 years of ignoring Our Lady of Fatima, we have paid a tremendous price. But as bad as that is, that price will be doubled or tripled in the next couple of years if we ignore her much longer. Just a few months ago, the world's population passed 7 billion people. 7 billion people. Scripture tells us, and other prophecies tell us, that 1/3 to 2/3 of the entire population of mankind will be wiped out in this war to come. I don't know what it takes to wake us up. Maybe we have to find it on NBC or CBS or some commentator in the New York Times before we finally take this seriously. And maybe we say to ourselves, we take it seriously, but I think we don't take it seriously enough. We have many priorities. Sometimes I wonder how I get through my day between what I'm supposed to do today, between getting up and doing my reading, doing my other work, talking to people that God wants me to talk to and so forth. And we only all have 24 hours a day. And I'm sure that my life is not as busy as the bishops and the Pope. But we must make this priority number one. There is nothing more serious, nothing more important, nothing more urgent than Our Lady's message at Fatima. And this is something that I don't know how to say. I remember getting a letter from an older bishop many years ago. I think he was in Ottawa. And he said to me basically in his letter, Father Gruner, if you would not raise your voice so much, if you would not yell at us, we might start paying attention to you. And I wrote back to him and I said, I appreciate very much your interest and your concern and your advice. Now, if you can tell me how I can do that any better than what I'm doing and get the attention, I'd be very happy to do it. I hate yelling at people. I hate raising my voice, and I hate trying to draw attention to myself. But there's no other way around on this message. If there's something more important, and certainly yesterday we were in this March for Life here in Rome, and the number of people that are killed by abortion since about 1975, by the statistics we looked up, is about 1,300,000 people. And by war, there's another 78 million people. And then by government murder, not only in Russia and China, but other parts of the world, 238 million people. These are catastrophic, and they lead us to think that we are, as Pope Pius XII, rather Pius X, St. Pius X said, that we are in the days just before the coming of the Antichrist. These things that are happening to us, which Pope Benedict, when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, said, that refer to this Fatima message is found in sacred scripture, that we are living the times of the apocalypse. And although we can be distracted with everything from daily newspapers to new movies or whatever else it is that entertains us, these things are happening around us, and they're happening every day. And they're happening in such a way that how can we deny that we're living in, if it's not the apocalypse, if it is not the time coming before the Antichrist, it is the best, shall we say, preview or event which the world has never seen before. Just looking at the Catholic Church, for example, the only other time in church history that comes close to this time is the Arian crisis, when 90% of the bishops were Arian. And there was only about 3 or 4 bishops who actually stood up. And the greatest of them all, St. Athanasius, was actually excommunicated by the Pope in 357 AD. Now, he wasn't really excommunicated because, as the Church has always recognized, as St. Thomas points out, that law is not something that just the legislator says. Law is the ordination of reason. It is for the common good. And as the Church law to this day points out, that no one can be punished if he doesn't commit a crime. So because Athanasius was standing up for the faith, because he was defending the faith, which was his duty to do, he could not be punished even if the Pope pronounced a sentence of excommunication. In fact, Liberius regretted his action, but Liberius is the first Pope not to be canonized from the time of St. Peter to the year 357. It's well for us to remember then that we need not be afraid of the judgments of men if we are on the right side of God. It's a principle that we need to keep in mind. We also have to understand that prophecy is a function in the Church. It's a function that will never go away. It's a function that must be respected, just as the apostolic offices must be respected. As St. Paul tells us in Ephesians, the Church is built upon the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, not just the apostles. The role of prophecy is essential. Scripture tells us that we must not extinguish the Spirit. We must not despise prophecy, but we must test all things and hold fast that which is good. So that is why I've promoted the message of Fatima, not only because it's unique among all the messages, but of course it's been approved by the Church. As Father Joseph St. Marie pointed out here in Rome, he's the one who wrote the speech for the Pope in 1982 when he went to Fatima. Father Joseph St. Marie points out that it is the role of the hierarchy to judge, to test whether the prophet speaks the truth. But once the hierarchy recognizes that the message comes from God, then the Pope himself and the bishops are bound to obey not the prophet, but God who speaks through the prophet to them. That obligation is primordial. That is not for us to say, I'm telling the Pope what to do. No, but Our Lady of Fatima is telling him what to do. All I do is explain what it means. I answer the objections of theologians or others who haven't had the time to think about it. So when we get back to 1917, Our Lady comes. She comes and gives a message to show mankind the way to peace. She was asked, she was insisted that she come. She comes and she explains. And then for the next 95 years, we basically ignore her. So our Lord himself in 1931 explained to the Pope and the bishops something, a lesson from history. He said, make it known to my ministers, given they follow the example of the King of France, in delaying the execution of my command, like the King of France, they will follow him into misfortune. What is that example he's talking about, the King of France? On the 17th of June, to the very day, the 17th of June, 1689, our Lord spoke to St. Margaret Mary and told her to tell the King of France to consecrate France to the Sacred Heart. Now the kings of France, there were 3 of them from that day, all ignored St. Margaret Mary's prophecy and our Lord's command through St. Margaret Mary. Even during her lifetime, St. Margaret Mary was known as a saint. She was well hidden, but her reputation for sanctity was well known among her contemporaries. And so, for them to ignore this, they paid with their lives. On the 17th of June, 1789, that's 100 years later to the day, the King of France was stripped of his authority by the Third Estate. 3 weeks later, the French Revolution, the storming of the Bastille. On the 20th or 21st of January, 1994, his head was cut off by the soldiers of the Revolution. And our Lord makes reference to this and says, make it known to my ministers, given they follow the example of the King of France, in delaying the execution of my command, like him, they will follow him into misfortune.
I have come to warn the faithful to amend their lives and ask pardon for their sins. They must not continue to offend our Lord, who is already deeply offended. In the final vision on October 13, 1917, Our Lady silently held out the scapular, a gesture which indicates that she wants everyone to wear it. Our Lady said, "If my requests are not heeded, Russia will spread her errors throughout the world, raising up wars and persecutions against the Church. The good will be martyred. The Holy Father will have much to suffer, and various nations will be annihilated."